Greetings and salutations, my friend. Was Socrates a real person? Where exactly lies the line between Socrates' ideas and Plato's ideas? Those are the questions I've been asking myself since I first got into the world of philosophy many years ago, and Plato, even though hasn't really been that influential on me personally, has sort of been my gateway into philosophy. And I think Plato is a gateway to the world of philosophy for many young people. I would say either Plato or Nietzsche are two very, very common ones. And you know, those aren't exactly unreasonable questions to ask, because I remember pretty much since the middle school we've been told what Socrates stood for, or what he said, like the famous quote, "I know that I know nothing." But as far as Socrates is concerned, what we can say that we know about Socrates is practically equivalent to nothing. So I know that I know nothing about Socrates. And that is for a very simple reason, which is, well, Socrates never really wrote anything. I think that Socrates, if he actually did exist, didn't write anything, probably because he wouldn't think that he has anything to write about, since he does not possess any kind of knowledge, and in any way he is more wise than others is that he's aware of his own ignorance. But because he's aware of his own ignorance, you might be thinking, well, how can an ignorant person write anything that has any sort of value to offer? I'm just an ignorant person. Why should I be writing anything? Well, it makes logical sense, right? During my days at the university a couple of years ago, I would even meet people who would claim that Socrates was nothing but a figment of Plato's imagination, sort of a character created by Plato. I mean, from one certain point of view, it would make sense, right? Plato created this character that comes with arguments and say things that people just can't deny, right? It's very common in Plato's dialogues that whenever Socrates says something, there isn't an immediate rebuttal from another side. There's no counter-argument. People will just say, certainly Socrates, of course Socrates, that's undeniable Socrates, that's obvious Socrates. I think that in some ways it sort of illustrates that Plato, like most thinkers really, is unable to find flaws with his own ideas, and therefore you have this character of Socrates, right, which, well, you can't really pose any counter-arguments to some of the things he said. And I think it's very, very common for many philosophers and thinkers to actually fall into that trap of not being able to come up with counter-arguments to your own arguments. It's a flaw of almost every single human. If you have managed to overcome that human flaw, you're one step further from most people, but most people are not there, and that goes for very, very intelligent people, because I'm not saying those are stupid people. Well, in some way they are. I think we're all stupid one way or another. As much as I doubt that Socrates has existed, because, well, it will be unreasonable to not doubt that when there is no primary source written by Socrates himself. At the same time, it would also be very unreasonable of me to not doubt that Socrates was just a figment of Plato's imagination, when we have actually proof that Socrates was likely much more than that, for a very simple reason really, and that is Socrates didn't exist only in Plato's work. And what do I mean by Socrates existing? Well, I think it's important to separate the character of Socrates from the real Socrates that actually existed, if he existed. So the Socrates we see in Plato's dialogues isn't really the real Socrates. I mean, it's obvious, right? It's sort of like Marcus Aurelius in Ridley Scott Gladiator film is not the real Marcus Aurelius. It's a portrayal of him. And maybe he did portray Marcus Aurelius accurately, maybe it did not. it doesn't really matter, it's still a portrayal. And the same can be said of Plato's Socrates. The question is, how accurate was Plato's description of Socrates? And, well, it's really hard to determine when we can't really compare it with a primary source. But what we can do is compare it to some other non-Platonic texts that concern themselves with Socrates. And most of the context I will be using in this video, as well as the sources, the texts that can possibly tell us anything about Socrates, will be coming either from Plato, Xenophon, or Aristophanes. Looking at the texts of Xenophon and Plato, we can conclude that Socrates likely had a military history, serving as a hoplite for Athenian army. And in one of Plato's late dialogues, Theaetetus, Socrates says that his mother was in fact a midwife, and he himself compares his method to the work of a midwife. Both Plato and Xenophon on few occasions offer us physical descriptions of Socrates, what Socrates might have looked like, and those descriptions are usually not very favorable. Socrates is usually described as not a very attractive man, to put it mildly, and that also plays a significant role in Aristophanes' play, Clouds. But honestly, I just don't think it's that interesting. I don't really think it matters what Socrates looked like. In a historical and philosophical context, it doesn't really matter. For all I care, Plato might have described Plato as someone who was smoking like a sailor and swearing like a chimney. It doesn't really make much difference. What we really do want to know is, what was Socrates' ideas? What did Socrates stand for? And can we actually be sure of any of that? Some sources would also suggest, including some of Plato's, that Socrates opposed democracy and supported Sparta. At that time, there was a big conflict going on between Sparta and Athens, the Peloponnesian War, and so it wasn't really a good image to be supportive of Sparta as an Athenian in Athens. And some of Socrates' associates were apparently, in fact, supporters of Sparta. And you know what they say about guilt by association, right? However, as much as there is this focus on Socrates opposing the democratic values of Athens, there are also parts of Plato's dialogues that actually suggest the opposite entirely. For instance, in Plato's Crito, Socrates refuses to escape from the jail in which he is being held before his trial and eventually execution, because Socrates was raised in a city that had those laws and values. Socrates thought it would be unjust of him to not live by those values and those laws, and so he decided to stand the trial in accordance with those laws, which would suggest that this is something he in fact believed in, or at least respected. And if he did also serve the Athenian military, that might also suggest at least some level of loyalty to Athens. Moreover, the rumors of Socrates being a Spartan sympathizer may have been spread by Aristophanes in his play Clouds, which portrayed Socrates as such. And it wouldn't be the first time that Aristophanes would portray Socrates in a way that is completely opposed to how, let's say, Plato or Xenophon presented Socrates to us. For instance, in Aristophanes' play, Socrates is a sophist. And what we know from Xenophon and Plato alike is that Socrates actually opposed the sophists in Greek society. Who exactly were sophists? They were both teachers and rhetoricians who were more concerned about winning the argument rather than attaining the knowledge and wisdom. In many ways, the sophists are kinda what's giving the rhetoricians, even today, this bad rep, really. Considering that Socrates exists in texts other than just Plato's, I don't think we have a sufficient argument to make that Socrates never really existed. Xenophon wrote about Socrates, so did Aristophanes and Plato, and there are multiple other people who wrote about Socrates, who had Socrates as at least a character or a main character in their dialogues. Unfortunately, most of that has not survived. Aristophanes, Plato, and Xenophon are three main sources of our possible knowledge of Socrates that we are in possession of. And even if those other texts did survive, they were still secondary texts about Socrates, not Socrates' own text. Because they didn't survive, all we have access to is mentions of those texts. So we have mentions of secondary texts about Socrates. It's sort of very similar to Plato's idea of art being the copy of a copy, right? It's almost a little poetic. Also, both Xenophon and Plato wrote about certain parts of Socrates' life that seem awfully similar, which makes me think that they might have participated in those events, and obviously one of them is being Socrates' trial. And so it happened that both Plato and Xenophon wrote a dialogue of the same title, Apology, featuring Socrates' speech and legal defense before his trial and before his unfortunate execution when he had to drink the hemlock. Xenophon's descriptions of Socrates discussing love at a symposium is also similar to some parts of Plato's symposium. I mean, you know, of course we could entertain such ludicrous ideas such as maybe Socrates was just a collective hallucination of sorts, but that is very, very unlikely. It is less likely than that we can take anything we think Socrates said with absolute certainty. Then again, when it comes to ancient Greece, a lot of the time the line between history and fiction isn't that clear with the existence of myths and so on. For instance, almost every Greek knew about Achilles, right? Some talked and wrote about Achilles. That doesn't mean that everything that happened in Homer would actually happen with Achilles, or that he actually existed. Socrates is not really a heroic figure as such, right? He's not some mythical hero by any means. He's no Hercules. For this reason, I think we should make a seemingly reasonable assumption that Socrates was a real person. But that still doesn't tell us much about Socrates' own opinions. Was Socrates merely a mouthpiece for Plato's ideas? Were Plato's ideas inspired by Socrates or completely different, and he just used the character of Socrates there? So making absolute claims that this is what Socrates thought, this is what Socrates said, are kind of weird to make, really. One example that comes to mind is a video by a YouTube channel named School of Life, which claims that Socrates hated democracy. It is not my intention to talk negatively about this channel by any means. I think some of their videos on philosophy are sort of a good introduction to the world of philosophy. However, I'm not sure if we can make such a statement that Socrates hated democracy or even opposed democracy, when such ideas were really planted by Plato. Moreover, all those portrayals of Socrates are not the same. While I don't think that Aristophanes Socrates is what real Socrates was actually like. It's a satirical, comedical portrayal of the character who's high in the clouds in that play, literally. While it may not tell us much about who Socrates was, I think that Aristophanes' play can teach us about how society at that time viewed Socrates. If so, then why are we even assigning quotes to Socrates? Like, Socrates said this, and well, Socrates' most popular quote is, "I know that I know nothing." And, well, we can't really know that Socrates ever said that. He never wrote it anywhere, and usually when we are quoting people from that time or from before audio and video recording was available, it is usually when that quote has been written by that person, and as we know, that is not the case in Socrates. However, A very similar quote has been written by Plato in Apology. So can we really trust that quote? Especially when the world of the internet today is filled with quotes assigned to certain philosophers that do not actually belong to them at all. Let's take a look at these two quotes by Aristotle. Can you tell me which one of these is fake? Yes, it is obviously this one. This does not sound like something that Aristotle would say. It does not sound like his style of writing. So we can't know if Socrates said that, but there is, however, a quote that is very similar to that in Plato's Apology. Then I examined this person. There's no need for me to mention him by name. He was one of our politicians. And when I examined him and talked with him, men of Athens, my experience was something like this. I thought this man seemed wise to many people, and especially to himself, but wasn't. Then I tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but wasn't. As a result, he came to dislike me, and so did many of the people present. For my part, I thought to myself as I left, I'm wiser than that person. For it's likely that neither of us knows anything, fine and good, but he thinks he knows something he doesn't know. Whereas I, since I don't in fact know, don't think that I do either. At any rate, it seems that I'm wiser than he is, just this one small way, that what I don't know, I don't think I know. I think this is the closest part of all of Plato's texts that comes close to what we consider to be an actual quote. I know that I know nothing. Well, as you can see, it's not even formulated in that same way. This, however, could be explained by a simple fact that there exist many translations of Plato's texts, similarly to how there exist several translations of the Bible, let's say, and not all of them read the same. The point is that the conveyed message is still the same nonetheless. In some way, you could say that Plato was both real and is not real. Well, the real Plato is the one that possibly existed, very likely did, whereas the Plato that is not real is the character of Plato, as we can see in Aristophanes' play and Xenophon's and Plato's dialogues. But in some way you could also argue that that Socrates, Xenophon's Socrates and Plato's and Aristophanes' Socrates, is also real in some way because he exists in those texts. But is still separate from the living, organic being that was Socrates, or a dead, organic being by now. What I think is even more interesting is the difference in portrayal of Socrates in both Xenophon's and Plato's texts. Plato's Socrates is in many ways more philosophical than Xenophon's Socrates. I think it's one of the reasons why people might think that Plato's Socrates is more correct one. However, I don't necessarily think that might be the case, because it is more likely that Plato is actually putting his own idea into Socrates' mouth. Because Plato was more philosophical than Xenophon, and so it makes sense that Plato's Socrates would be more philosophical than Xenophon's Socrates. I think that the best way to describe Plato's Socrates, at least in the early dialogues, because there has been quite a shift in Plato's writing style and the themes of his writings, which I'm going to discuss later, but as far as those early dialogues are concerned, I think the best way to describe Socrates is as someone who acknowledges his ignorance, but at the same time sees it as virtue to pursue knowledge, to pursue wisdom, even if he would not achieve it. Xenophon's Socrates is someone more practical, someone more pragmatic, with a much stronger character. This is how Xenophon represents Socrates. And it makes sense because Xenophon didn't really have that same philosophical background as Plato. While Plato's Socrates doesn't really claim to know anything. Xenophon's Socrates has more confidence in the things he says. I think the most clear contrast between the two exists in Apology, and because they just so happened to both write Socrates' Apology before his execution, I think it's just such a perfect place to compare the two. Socrates had to stand trial on 2 charges of blasphemy and corrupting the youth, and Xenophon's Socrates doesn't really deny that he is a teacher. He represents Socrates as someone with a very, very strong character in his defense. This is quite the opposite from Plato's Socrates, who is, first of all, more humble, but also doesn't claim that he has been, in fact, teaching anything, because he doesn't claim to know anything, but that the youth of Athens are actually taking interest in his method. Here's a part from Plato's Apology that I think perfectly captures what I meant. And if you've heard from anyone that I undertake to educate people and charge fees, that's not true either. Although it also seems to me to be a fine thing if anyone's able to educate people in the way Gorgias of Leontini does, and Prodicus of Chaos, and Hippias of Elis. For each of them, gentlemen, can enter any city and persuade the young, who may associate with any of their own fellow citizens they want to, free of charge, to abandon those associations, and associate with them instead, pay them a fee, and be grateful to them besides. With this, I am entering the second section of this video, in which I'm going to try to provide an answer of sorts to where exactly does the line between Socrates and Plato lie. Normally we can distinguish between 3 periods of Plato's writings: the early dialogues, the middle dialogues, and the late dialogues. The early dialogues of Plato are very epistemological in their nature. It's still an ethical epistemology, but epistemology nonetheless, dealing with the possibility and certainty of knowledge. In those early dialogues, Socrates would usually go on to have a conversation with a specific figure, which the title of the dialogue is usually named after. That will change later on. There are a few exceptions, such as Symposium or On the Laws, but at least in those early dialogues, with exception of Apology, of course, most of them are always named after that specific person that Socrates is talking to. The goal of those conversations is to always answer a question of an epistemological ethical nature, such as what is piety in his conversation with Euthyphro, what is virtue in his conversation with Meno, what is justice in his first conversation with Alcibiades, what is rhetoric in his conversation with Gorgias. What usually follows is that the person Socrates is talking to would provide their own definition of what those things actually are. And then Socrates would question them and cross-examine the inconsistencies in their definitions. This method, popularly known as the Socratic method, is called elenchus, from the Greek elenchos, to refute, to disprove. And as Socrates attempts to poke holes in their definitions, and they eventually try to change that definition to fit what they just learned from Socrates, it eventually leads to the later stage of these Socratic dialogues, which is aporia, in Greek meaning lack of passage, impossible to pass, or confusion or puzzlement.
Confusion of the highest order.
This is an interesting stage because this here is where the attempt to define something such as virtue or knowledge or piety stops, and the person Socrates is talking to realizes, I don't really know. And it's sort of a blockade, right? Because how can you move forward if you don't even know that? And those dialogues, those early dialogues, usually don't really have a conclusion to aporia. It stops at aporia, and the point of those dialogues is that they don't really need that conclusion. In more recent years, Socratic method has been used again as a form of street epistemology, which has been highly popularized by Peter Boghossion's book, The Manual for Creating Atheists. One of the people that is most known for using this method is Anthony Magnabosco, which is an individual I actually had a pleasure to meet a couple of years ago here in Oslo. Both the content of Boghossion's book as well as Anthony Magnabosco's method is largely concerned with religion. Magnabosco, who also has his YouTube channel, talks to people on the street about their beliefs, and through asking those questions tries to understand the reasoning behind their argument for, let's say, God's existence, usually not telling them they're wrong, because that's not what the Socratic method is about at all, but rather to lead them into an aporia.
When you hope that you pass the test, is there not an element of a possibility that you might fail the test?
Yes.
Is hope the same way? Does hope does faith have an element of it possibly not happening or not being true?
I guess that's just something that you just don't know until you die. If we talk about Jesus, you know what I mean?
This changes, however, when we enter Plato's middle period. That's when the conversation moves away from the epistemological and more towards the metaphysical, ethical, and political. Gone is the elenchus and aporia. Now there's more focus on the doctrine and what Socrates is actually saying in those dialogues. This is also where some of Plato's themes become more central, such as the soul, the forms and ideas, and how the state of society should be run. The latter being one of the main themes in Plato's Republic, which is probably Plato's most well-known work, which is also where some of his most famous quotes on the idea of forms is actually coming from with the Plato's cave allegory. I think that the switch from Plato's early dialogues to middle dialogues is overall more interesting from his switch from the middle to late dialogues. I think that the shift from early to middle dialogues also signifies a huge philosophical shift from one method to another, whereas I think that the late period is sort of a natural conclusion to the middle period, a natural evolution. It largely deals with a lot of those same themes. Those late dialogues are also very political and at times very metaphysical, also dealing with themes of death and reincarnation. Now, I think that the shift from early to middle dialogues is of great importance if we are to discuss where exactly Socrates ends and Plato begins. And some people would love to say that Socrates ends where the early dialogues end, and that's where Plato's begin. Like, those were Socrates' ideas, now we have Plato's ideas. Well, I don't think it's that simple. I think we can say that there are three possible explanations or theories when it comes to this ideological connection of Plato and Socrates. The first theory is that those aren't really Plato's ideas in all of those periods, but merely he immortalized the thoughts of Socrates, who never wrote anything, and so they exist through Plato, and as such Socrates also exists through Plato. In this theory, Plato's thoughts don't really exist because it's all Socrates, really. And a shift from early to middle dialogues could be possibly explained by the fact that Socrates himself has also undergone a philosophical change. Why I think that's unlikely, I'll leave that for later when I'll be discussing arguments for or against those theories. The second theory, which I think is the most mainstream one by now, is that Plato started, as Socrates' student that he started to report on Socrates' dialogues, and those dialogues were actually more accurate concerning what they actually looked like, what Socrates was actually like, and they sort of represent Socrates' philosophy, whereas after the shift from the early to middle dialogues, Plato abandons Socrates in favor of writing about his own ideas. Well, it would make sense, right? Plato had a chance to develop as a person, as a philosopher, and has developed his own ideas that he now wants to write, but he continues using the character of Plato to convey those ideas because this is what he has been doing before that shift. The third theory is the exact opposite of the first one. In this one, those were never Socrates' ideas to begin with. It was always Plato who was just using Socrates as a mouthpiece. And so there really is no Socrates. There is also only the fictitious Socrates of Plato, and those dialogues are absolutely only a work of fiction. Okay, maybe not exactly a complete work of fiction. There could still be like some truth to the events that happened in those dialogues, but their content is largely just Plato's ideas, really. Is there any sufficient way to confirm theory number one? Not really, but I guess we can support it in a way, because writing dialogues was a very common way of writing at the time when both Plato and Xenophon existed. This also has its roots in play writing, so most books were also written like that, such as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Everything was written to be performed on the stage because Greeks had a really rich theater culture, and so it's not really that strange that those philosophical works at the time were also written in the form of dialogues. If you think about it, all Plato's dialogues could be performed on the stage. They could be a play. If they are more or less an accurate description of what actually went down and what those conversations looked like, is it possible? Well, I'm not sure if it is actually feasible to fully reproduce a conversation, but I think it is absolutely plausible that people would have the need and the desire to preserve the conversations in time, and so I think it's understandable that while the conversation went on, someone would sit down and write it down, a transcript of sorts, an early version of an audio or video recording. Although I think that both audio and video recording is more effective than writing it down, because it comes with a challenge to be able to note down everything while the conversation happens. Either the conversers have to slow down in order for the person to write it down, or they would have a really hard time keeping up with it, right? In Plato's dialogue Theaetetus, Euxester, I think that's how their names are pronounced. I'm not really sure. It could be Euk, Euk. I don't really think it matters. The person is still the same. So Euk says to Ter that he has recorded the conversation between Socrates and Theaetetus. He was in a hurry to get home. Indeed, I asked him myself and advised him to stay, but he did not want to. So I saw him on his way, and as I was coming back, I was reminded of Socrates, and how prophetically he spoke in general, and about Theaetetus in particular. Socrates met him as a young man, I believe shortly before his own death. And from the company and the discussions he was very pleased with his character. He recounted their discussions to me when I arrived in Athens, and they are well worth hearing. And he said that Theaetetus simply must become famous if he actually lived long enough. Ter. Well, it seems he was right about that anyway, but what were these discussions? Can you recount them? Euk. No, by Zeus, not from memory at any rate, but I made notes at the time as soon as I arrived home, and later on I recollected them at my leisure and wrote them down. Whenever I went to Athens, I would ask Socrates again about whether I did not remember, and once I got back here, I would make corrections, so that I have now written out almost the entire discussion. Now, I find this part to be particularly interesting because it might be an insight into how the process of writing those dialogues might have looked like, and that they may be, in fact, based on actual conversations that took place. People were writing down the notes about what went down, and if they weren't sure about what was being said or the meaning behind what was being said, they could always ask the person or the persons who were involved in the conversation. I think it adds an element of believability to the fact that those dialogues could in fact be recollections of actual conversations that went down, which would support that Plato is actually recalling what Socrates said, and so proving that those are in fact Socrates' ideas, thoughts, and that is what Socrates said. Of course, there exists a chance that it's all fiction, and so even this part written in Thetis about writing those notes and recalling the conversations is part of the fiction, and that is not what actually went down. That is also something we actually have to take into consideration as well. The thematical and philosophical shift in Plato's writing, however, might suggest that either theory 2 or 3 might be true. For a very simple reason, and that is that this indicates progression and evolution of ideas. Now, why I think it sort of excludes theory number 1? Well, there exists a chance that this was in fact a Socrates evolution of thoughts and ideas, but considering that all middle and late dialogues of Plato were written after Socrates' death, what that would actually require is Plato going back to Socrates, who's been dead for years, and recalling his ideas and sort of writing them down later on with a major delay. I think that's less likely than Plato himself actually moving away from Socrates and developing his own ideas. Now, I think this proves both theory number 2 and 3 because that evolution of ideas could have also nothing to do with Socrates. In fact, perhaps Plato wasn't as inspired by Socrates as some would like to think. Or maybe this character of Socrates here is based on more than just one person, Plato's teacher being just one of them. Besides, I think it's also quite symbolic in a way that after Socrates' death, Plato becomes his own man. And in some of Plato's later dialogues, they don't feature Socrates as much as his earlier dialogues. And at the same time, some of those dialogues don't include Socrates at all. I think this further can confirm that Plato wanted to move away from Socrates. Now, assuming that the shift in Plato's writing was a shift in Plato's philosophy, now it will be a little bit harder to determine whether that shift has been Plato's independent evolution of thought, or if it was him actually moving away from Socrates' ideas. And we know there is a shift, but I don't think it makes it any easier to draw a clear line, like this is where Socrates stops, and this is where Plato begins, because that shift isn't really that clear. What I mean by that is that there's not a single line where we can divide the two, and I think that making those clear categories of early dialogues and middle dialogues doesn't really explain this shift in and of itself. It's not like the line lies right in between them, like, oh, here we have early dialogues, here we have middle dialogues. If you read them in a chronological order, you may notice that this shift isn't really that sudden, it's actually very gradual. It's sort of like, let's make a transition from this clip to the next. Can you tell me where exactly the previous clip ended and this one began? Which percentage of a second was that? When did the old stop and the new began? Well, it's not that easy to tell, right? And something very similar can be said about Plato's dialogues. One could say that the middle period started with Meno. Makes sense, right? It's the first dialogue that introduces the concept of forms and immortality of the soul. At the same time, thematically, it doesn't really seem that different from the early dialogues. It's not that big of a shift. It's more like you have a cake, and then you make the second cake that is identical to the previous one, but you put a cherry on the top. The addition of those themes seemed like something extra, without making a dramatic change to the structure of the dialogue in and of itself. The nature of Socrates' conversation with Meno is in fact still very epistemological, concerning the theme of what is virtue. Plato's Republic, which was written after Meno, while its later parts differ quite a lot from those early dialogues, they're in fact of completely different nature. The beginning of the Republic, however, seems very much like the themes we would explore in the early dialogues. It's still an epistemological question being asked. What is justice? Not only that, but that theme of justice has also been explored in Plato's first dialogue with Alcibiades. I think that starting from Meno and going to the Republic, you can see this gradual shift happening from one dialogue to the next. In many ways, I like to think of the middle period as sort of a transitional period, whereas the late period is sort of similar to the later parts of the Republic. I think this is where the late stages of Plato's writings actually started to form at that point. Because Meno is still written in a fashion that is so similar to the early dialogues, we could, of course, entertain the idea that Plato was still recalling Socrates' thoughts and ideas here. And let me take on three themes that have actually very minor presence in Meno, but I think are of great importance to Plato's later work. And that is the immortality of the soul, the forms, and ruling as a virtue. Because they've been introduced at what can be considered the later stages of early dialogues or early stages of the middle dialogues, as such we can't really know if those are the themes that Plato introduced or if they were introduced by Socrates and Plato built up on top of that. In Meno, Socrates talks to this boy who is a slave about the length of the side of the square. At first, the boy thinks that he knows what he doesn't know and has a level of certainty and confidence about it, while later on realizes, oh my god, I don't know. And reaching this stage of aporia, which was present in the earlier dialogues by Plato, and usually that was the conclusion of the dialogue. Socrates. But from which one does it result? Try to tell us exactly. If you don't want to calculate its length, point to which one it results from. Boy. But by Zeus, Socrates, I really don't know. Socrates, turning to Meno. Do you see, Meno, what point he has reached as he proceeds on the path of recollection? At first, he did not know what the side of the 8-foot figure is, just as he does not at all know at this point either. But then he at least thought he knew, answered confidently, as if he knew, and didn't think he was puzzled. At this point, however, he now does believe he is puzzled, and as he does not in fact know, he does not think he does either. One thing in Meno that I think truly marks the shift and the progression in Plato's writings is that it doesn't stop at aporia. It continues from there to arrive at a more dogmatic conclusion, really, that what we think we don't know, the soul knows. Because the soul is immortal and eternal, it does in fact possesses all the facts. It knows everything. We just have to reach for it. Socrates, turning to Meno. What do you think, Meno? Is there any belief he gave us as an answer that is not his own? Meno. No, they are his own. Socrates. And yet he did not know the answer, as we said a short while ago. Meno. That's right. Socrates. But these beliefs were in him, at least, were they not? Meno. Yes. Socrates. So the one who does not have knowledge about whatever things he does not know has true beliefs in him about the things he does not know. Meno. Apparently. Socrates. And now, by contrast, these beliefs have been stirred up in him like a dream. But if someone asks him these same questions many times and in many ways, you know that in the end he will have knowledge of them that is no less exact than anyone else's. Meno. So it seems. Socrates. Then he will have knowledge without being taught by anyone, but only questioned, since he will have recovered the knowledge from inside himself. Now, I'm going to skip part of the dialogue here to get to the meat and the potatoes of this theme. Socrates. Then, if the truth about the things that are is always in our soul, the soul is immortal. So you should confidently try to inquire about and collect what you do not happen to know at present, that is, what you do not remember. In Phaedo, Plato revisits the topic of recollecting one's non-empirical knowledge from the soul, but also adds more to the soul. And I think Phaedo is what truly starts to focus on the idea of forms. In Plato's philosophy, the forms are lasting, they're existing in the world of ideas, whereas everything in the physical world is sort of a manifestation of those forms, and as such, everything that is physical is temporary. Because the forms are not temporary, they are in fact eternal, that is where our soul actually exists. On top of that, Plato also talks about the circulation, how something can become something from something else that is opposite of that thing. So somebody has to be alive in order for them to turn dead. I'm going to revisit Phaedo at some point here on my channel because I want to make a video on reincarnation in a few months, and then I'm going to go more in depth on this particular work of Plato. One other theme that becomes very central in the later stages of Plato's middle dialogues is the concept of the philosopher king. And much as the concept of immortal soul, it wasn't just introduced in one particular book and fully explored there. We have also seen sort of an evolution of that concept. And Republic makes much more sense if you have read Plato's previous works. The idea of ruling being a virtue is already present in Meno, even though it's only mentioned in a small part of this book. If we go even further back than that, though, all the way to the Apology, in which Socrates, at least the fictional Socrates, the character of Socrates, and just to be clear, I am talking here about Plato's Apology, not Xenophon's Apology, in which Plato discusses themes of democracy and the philosopher king that will later on be very crucial in Plato's Republic, even though Socrates never actually uses the term philosopher king, but we all know what he means, and those his ideas about democracy presented in Apology are what we popularly assigned as Socrates' ideas about democracy, or Socrates' dislike towards democracy, or how School of Life chose to call it the hate for democracy. This part of the Apology reads, and I just realized I have been quoting Apology quite a lot in this video, haven't I? Yeah, kinda. My apology. Now answer me this. Do you think that the same holds of horses? Do people in general improve them, whereas one particular person corrupts them or makes them worse? Or isn't it wholly the opposite? One particular person, or the very few who are horse trainers, is able to improve them, whereas the majority of people, if they have to do with horses and make use of them, make them worse. Isn't that true, Meletus, both of horses and all other animals? Of course it is, whether you and Anytus say no or not. Indeed, our young people are surely in a very happy situation if only one person corrupts them, whereas all the rest benefit them. And while the context of this particular quote is really about Socrates claiming that his interactions with the youth of Athens doesn't corrupt them, I think it can also be applied to ruling. As in, the majority of the people don't know what is best for the nation, the society, and the people, and their involvement would only lead to corruptions, whereas the few who possess that kind of virtue know how to rule and as such will make things better. While this is the main theme of Republic, and actually Republic is a book that has many different themes in it, ranging from politics, ethics to metaphysics, and even touching on controlled reproduction that is awfully similar to eugenics. I think the theme of the philosopher king is really the most central and important in Republic. Until philosophers rule as kings in their cities, or those who are nowadays called kings and leading men become genuine and adequate philosophers, so that political power and philosophy become thoroughly blended together, while the numerous natures that now pursue either one exclusively are compelled not to do so, cities will have no rest from evils, my dear Glaucon. Later on, Socrates says, if we are going to escape from the people you mention, I think we need to define for them who the philosophers are that we dare to say should rule, so that once that is clear, one can defend oneself by showing that some people are fitted by nature to engage in philosophy and to take the lead in a city, while there are others who should not engage in it, but should follow a leader. To me, personally, the ideas presented in Republic both hit home, while at the same time I also disagree. As an anarchist, I also dislike how democracy functions, both in today's modern society as well as in the classical antiquity in Athens. Sometimes for some very similar reasons too. At the same time, I also think that the solution Plato, or maybe Socrates, proposes in Republic is actually awfully authoritarian. However, that is a topic for a completely different video, which I want to make at some point. As you can see, similarly to the ideas of forms and the immortal soul, the political themes of the Republic aren't actually coming out of the blue. The seeds of the Republic have been there since those more early dialogues. This further complicates things because, well, were those originally Socrates' ideas that Plato's built upon? And so, if perhaps Socrates actually did hate democracy, if that is the case, or did Plato develop these ideas progressively on his own? What I think I can say with, well, not with certainty, because I don't think we can say anything with certainty here, but what makes logical sense to me is that Plato didn't just abandon Socrates at some point. If those ideas in the first place were Socrates. This leaves us with quite a puzzle, doesn't it? I'm as puzzled as the characters in Plato's dialogues. We all are puzzled by this. If you want to know exactly which ideas stem from Socrates, which ideas stem from Plato, we're in for a challenge. And of course, we could make an argument that at some point Plato was actually more inspired by Pythagoras than Socrates. The idea of form, which is so present in Plato, actually also stems from Pythagoras. Like the concept of the matter and the form being two different things was first introduced by Pythagoras, and as we know, it is a very common theme in both Plato's and Aristotle's philosophy, even though Plato and Aristotle have very different take on what the form is, which is perfectly illustrated by this painting in which Plato is pointing up to the sky, whereas Aristotle is pointing down to the ground. This painting doesn't really help us when we try to distinguish between Socrates and Plato's ideas, because in this painting, Plato pointing up to the sky is also very thematically similar to one of the reasons Socrates was condemned to a trial, concerned with things above the earth, up in the sky. As he also Aristophanes' play Clouds, in which Socrates is on a swing up in the clouds. And you know, I think our inquiring instinct here is to try and solve that puzzle. But what if I were to tell you that if we did have a solution, it wouldn't actually make things any better? If we could 100% confirm that either theory 1, 2 or 3 is true, all come with a set of issues. If theory number 1 holds true, and Plato did in fact only recall and write down what Socrates said and meant, can we trust that Plato actually correctly represented Socrates' ideas, that the context of Socrates' thoughts isn't actually lost in the process, or that Plato interprets it in a way that wasn't Socrates? This leaves us with an untrustworthy and inaccurate text. Now, if we are to actually find that theory number 3 is true, that it's all just Plato's ideas, that Socrates here is nothing but a fictional character and none of his thoughts can be attributed to the actual historical Socrates, then we have another problem, and that is that we can't really know anything about Socrates, and a lot of ideas that we assign to Socrates aren't actually Socrates. And if we are to find out that theory number 2 is true, that Plato started as a Socrates student, he was just writing down the ideas and thoughts of Socrates and then moved on to write down his own ideas, we went full circle back to where we started. We are trying to determine where exactly the line between the two lies, right? Like, did he just abandon him at some point? Was it a gradual shift which was actually inspired by the seeds that come from Socrates? We're back to point A. We haven't solved shit.
We ain't found shit.
Therefore, you know, I'm asking myself this question. Is it worth it, solving this puzzle? Is it worth the time and effort? Because probably we will never know. We will never find out. And you know what? If you think about it, it's actually not that uncommon that we can draw a clear line between ideas of one person and another person, especially when our ideas get influenced by other ideas we build on top of that. Like, can you tell me exactly where the line between Marx and Hegel lies? And you know, even when I look at myself, right, and I'm thinking of those philosophers that I agree with the most, such as David Chalmers, Heidegger, Aristotle, and so on, where does me start and they end? I mean, obviously I'm a different person, but are my ideas actually my own? Or maybe they are, because, you know, perhaps I wasn't influenced by them, perhaps I just agree with them because those are the thoughts I already hold and they make sense to me. But can I know it with certainty? Truly not. And if you think about it, I don't think it's that different with Plato and Socrates. The only thing that complicates the whole damn thing is that because Socrates didn't write anything, we don't really have the material we can compare it to, and hence why it's so mystifying. At the end of the day, I don't really think it matters whether those thoughts are Plato's or Socrates, because, well, by today's standards, where we are right now, neither Plato nor Socrates exist. But the ideas written in Plato's dialogues do. And you know what? That's the thing about history, especially if you go back all the way to classical antiquity and so on, is that people don't survive, but the ideas do. And does it matter who these people are? Or are we more concerned with the ideas because the ideas are more present today than the actual people? I like to think of the ideas of Socrates and Plato as sort of a marriage. There was only one outlet of those ideas. Of course, you know, one of them will be more prominent than the other. But like I said, it's about the ideas, it's not about the people. That was a long video, wasn't it? It's got quite dark here, and it was light when I started. It's raining, it's dark and depressing. Yeah. This is why Norway has so many depressed people here. For real. It's only 3 p.m. here. And it's going to be dark soon. Especially at this time of year. The night comes early, creeping upon you. And so, to not succumb to the depression, I have to do something fun right now, like listen to baby metal. Baby metal always puts me in a good mood. And that's what I'm going to do, and I hope you have an amazing day, and I hope you do something fun too, like watching this video. It's fun, right? I hope it was. If you thought it was fun, please go check out other videos on my channel. I really do all kinds of shit here. It's all over the place. I'm just being me here, really. Anyway, yeah, have an awesome day. I'll see you next time. Ciao.